Доброго вечора всім, хто мене чує на цій прекрасній зустрічі. That's all that I'm going to say in Ukrainian. Hi, everyone. And thank you all for coming, friends and colleagues who are listening to us. Today, we are honored to welcome Graham Harman, who is an American philosopher and one of the most influential contemporary thinkers in Anglophone continental philosophy. Graham Harman is Distinguished Professor of Philosophy at the Southern California Institute of Architecture in Los Angeles. He began his teaching career with 16 years at the American University in Cairo before moving to Los Angeles in 2016. And he is the author of 25 books, which cover various fundamental philosophical questions. And this particular meeting is dedicated to publication of Professor Harman's books in Ukraine. The first one was Object-Oriented Ontology, a New Theory of Everything. And the second one is the most recent publication, Waves and Stones on the Ultimate Nature of Reality. Both were published by Contour, and we are proud to say that these are the first books by Graham Harman to appear in Ukrainian. And today with us are the founders of Contour, Roman Oksanyuk, Anastasia Holявka, Volodymyr Yevtushenko, the scientific editor of the books, Vasyl Korchevny, who you have already heard today, and myself, Yulia Kulish, who served as the literary editor of both of the books. We are also glad to mention Bogdan Peredri, one of the translators of Waves and Stones, who joined the project during the final stages of the translation, and the other and principal translator who worked on both books, Roman Cherevko. Unfortunately, he could not join us today as he's currently serving in the military. And in this sense, Roman not only made this translation possible, but it is also helping to make this very conversation possible. And for that, of course, we are deeply grateful to him and to the armed forces of Ukraine. Okay, guys, a brief note on the meeting format. We will begin with Professor Harman's main talk, like a lecture presentation. Then it will be followed by a Q&A session. We have gathered preliminary some of the questions via Google form, but of course you can still pose your questions in the chat. I've already mentioned either Ukrainian or English, anything will go. And this recording will be available on YouTube shortly on our channel. You can rewatch it as many times as you want. And in general, be free to tag Contour Publishing anywhere, I don't know, some photos, whatever you want. And as we are seeing, our lecturer is going to get home very soon. We can finally start talking about philosophy objects and so on and so on, as the famous saying goes.
Well, actually, and since two books have been translated into Ukrainian, the first being Object-Oriented Ontology, A New Theory of Everything, which I published in 2018, and is quickly becoming my most famous book, replacing the earlier ones. And then Waves and Stones on the Ultimate Nature of Reality, my most recent book, published in November in English, and then I think in January in Ukrainian. So you had it in Ukrainian too. You're the first language other than English in which that book has appeared. So I was really amazed by the speed. Thank you very much for everyone who made that possible. All right, Object-Oriented Ontology. Some of you may know more about it than others. My original background in philosophy was in Heidegger. And my dissertation, my PhD dissertation, which I finished in 1999, was about the famous tool analysis in Being and Time. And most of you know it, but in case you don't, Heidegger, a student of Husserl, was considered to be the great hope of phenomenology. And his tool analysis was really his critical response to Husserl's phenomenology. Of course, in phenomenology, what we start with is what is given to consciousness. We don't start by making theories about the world. We start by simply describing exactly how things in the world are given to consciousness. And to oversimplify slightly, Heidegger's change on that was simply to say that most of the time things are not given to us. Most of the time things are withdrawn from us or hide from us. And this is best explained in his famous tool analysis published in Being and Time, but it goes all the way back to his first lecture course in Freiburg when he was 29 years old. So it's a very old concern for Heidegger. This idea that most of the time I am taking things for granted. I'm using the floor, which is not collapsing. I am breathing oxygen without thinking about it. I am relying on my nervous system functioning properly. I am relying on everyone's knowledge of English grammar to understand what I am saying. And usually, according to Heidegger, we notice these things only when they go wrong. So I think that's maybe the most fundamental passage in 20th century philosophy. I would make that case. But there are a couple of features of Heidegger's tool analysis that I thought were wrong, even from a pretty early stage. And this is what led to the development of object-oriented ontology. The first of these is that for Heidegger, tools all fit into a system. He says, in the strict sense, there's no such thing as an equipment, as one equipment, because each piece of equipment refers to all the others. And finally, all the pieces of equipment refer to my Dasein. So the floor that's in this apartment isn't just a physical pieces of wood. It's something that supports my Dasein and the projects of my life and so forth. But the problem with this is that they're only in a system insofar as they are working well. The fact that an individual tool can break shows that it was already different from the entire system. So when something goes wrong in a tool system, it is not the system as a whole that goes wrong. It's because maybe I kick my foot while I'm talking to you and I hurt my toe on the table. It's my toe that hurts. It's not the entire system that hurts, which means that my toe was already individual. It wasn't swallowed up into the system. So there are already individual pieces. Individual pieces for Heidegger are treated as if they're a byproduct of the system breaking down, that fundamentally everything is a whole, and then only through malfunction do individual pieces of equipment break and become visible. Whereas for me, that was illogical, that there are already individuals prior to the system. Another more basic point maybe is that the tool analysis is not just about tools, because the tool analysis is about the way things hide. And it's not just hammers and saws and drills that hide. It's any entity that hides. We even hide from ourselves. And in that sense, we are tools. If introspection were perfectly possible, nobody would need psychoanalysis or therapy or even introspection, because our own psyches would be completely transparent to us, which they are not. But here's the big risk that Tripolo takes. For Heidegger, just as for Kant, the fact that things hide is the product of the fact that humans are finite. For Kant, it's human intuition of the world that is guided by categories and guided by the pure intuitions of space and time. And so it's some uniquely human problem that we cannot reach the thing in itself. And for Heidegger also, tools withdraw from humans because we are conscious and finite, much like for Kant. Whereas I pushed it a step further and said that objects withdraw from each other as well. And it's easy to see this. I used the example from medieval Islamic philosophy of fire burning cotton. When fire burns cotton, fire does not interact with all the features of the cotton, and the cotton does not interact with all the features of the fire. They are causally finite. They only interact in a limited way with each other. And so it's not human consciousness or Dasein that is finite. Any interaction between two terms is finite, because two things will never fully be in a position to interact with each other. Every interaction between things is partial. And so that with that step, we are back more into the pre-Kantian universe. And there's not really too many people who accept that. In continental philosophy, the price of admission is agreeing with the transcendental starting point. You have to start with human access to the world. To talk about fire burning cotton is seen as some sort of naive dogmatic metaphysics. My answer to that is that we have just as direct an access to fire burning cotton as we do to our own thoughts, because our own thoughts are not transparent to us. Again, the point about psychoanalysis. We know from Lacan, for example, that human access to our own minds is mediated. It's mediated through the other. And so we don't have any more direct access to ourselves than we do to inanimate objects. And I think the only recent precedent for this in the history of philosophy would be Alfred North Whitehead's, and I'm not sure how popular he is in Ukraine, if at all. He's become more popular in continental philosophy through Deleuze, because Deleuze was a great admirer of Whitehead's. But Whitehead is interesting because, first of all, he was writing his great works at the same time as Heidegger, but they didn't really know about each other's work, it seems. I think one of them refers to each other once. I think maybe Heidegger refers to Whitehead once, and Whitehead never refers to Heidegger. Process and Reality was written at about the same time as Sein und Zeit, Being and Time. But what's really admirable about Whitehead is he's the only one who doesn't accept the Kantian argument. He says the human thought's relation to the world is just a special case of any relation, which is just like what you get in Leibniz or some other pre-Kantian thinker. But the price of admission in continental philosophy is the Kantian starting point, we can only talk about human access to the world. Anything else is a thing in itself, and we can't say anything about it. And then analytic philosophy has a different price of admission. In analytic philosophy, you have to assume that mathematics and physics are the master discourses. I've been studying Frege a lot lately, and of course, for Frege, everything has to be very clear. Everything has to take the form of a proof. Although ironically, Frege ends up admitting that a lot of statements are ambiguous and you can't have a clear proof for everything. But be that as it may, you can see OOO as having some alliance with Alfred North Whitehead, and more directly with Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour, the late French philosopher, sociologist, anthropologist, who was also deeply influenced by Whitehead. So you could say that OOO started as an unusual reading of Heidegger, and I happened to become familiar professionally and personally with Bruno Latour right at about that time, and veered in that direction. Another thing about Latour is that he has a sense of humor in a way that Heidegger really does not. You're not going to laugh a lot while you're reading Heidegger, but Latour, very witty man. So there's a different style from Heidegger involved as well. Heidegger, very somber, serious, and some people like that. But my interpretation of Heidegger's question of the meaning of being is that it's not just a question, that Heidegger provides a provisional answer to the question of the meaning of being. The meaning of being is withdrawal. It's non-presence. Now, let me just say here quickly, what's the difference then between Heidegger and Derrida, who's also a critic of presence? I think there's a very simple difference. I think Derrida goes a step too far. Derrida's a little more radical, but more radical doesn't always mean more right. For Derrida, even self-identity is an illegitimate form of presence, whereas I don't think that's the case for Heidegger. For Heidegger, this hammer is this hammer. It is what it is, A equals A. Whereas Derrida would say something like the hammer already differs from itself. So it sounds more radical. I just don't think it's justified. I think that's the real difference between how Heidegger and Derrida critique metaphysics. All right, so that's the first principle of object-oriented ontology. There are others, of course, and I could go in any order from there. But perhaps the main direction to go to from there is that aesthetics becomes very important for object-oriented ontology, because as I pointed out in the book, the first book you publish in Ukrainian, the real enemy of object-oriented ontology is what I call literalism. And literalism can be defined as the view that an object is nothing more than a sum total of qualities. If you know all the qualities of an object, you know the object. And the philosophical model for this, of course, is David Hume. David Hume is the ultimate literalist, because for David Hume, there are no objects. If you see an apple is just red, round, cold, hard, juicy, sweet, all of those combined. There's nothing called an apple that's more than those qualities. And so there are some implications for this. One of the implications is that if anything changes its qualities even a little bit, then it's no longer the same object, because an object is nothing more than a bundle of qualities. And so not only are objects dying and being reborn every second, but so are you. Because if objects are bundles of qualities, for Hume, human beings are bundles of perceptions. And since your perceptions are changing slightly every instant, you are actually a different person who's dying and being recreated every instant as your perceptions change. And Whitehead inherits this. Whitehead, as an English philosopher, is very indebted to British empiricism. And Whitehead also thinks you're dying every second. And so although Whitehead is a philosopher of religion, there's no point worrying about the immortality of your soul because your soul is dying and being reborn every second anyway. Now, I work from a different intuition, and the different intuition, I think, comes from phenomenology. And that intuition comes from Edmund Husserl, because those of you who know Husserl will know that he talks about adumbrations, or Abschattungen in German, this idea that you see a person and they're moving around. You see talks about his friend Hans walking down the street, and his friend Hans takes off his hat and tips his hat. And as Hans becomes closer, I'm seeing different qualities of him at different seconds. But it's still my friend Hans at every instant. It's not a slightly different friend every second. It's the same friend Hans. He's just showing different Abschattungen every second. He's still the same person. In the logical investigations, Husserl gives a lot of examples of this. Another is of a blackbird flying through your garden. As the blackbird is flapping its wings and you're seeing it from different angles, it's still the same blackbird. You're pointing to the same blackbird. So it's almost like Saul Kripke in analytic philosophy with the rigid designator. You're pointing at the same thing. In fact, Husserl uses the term fixed appellations decades before Kripke. It sounds a lot like Kripke's rigid designator. So for me, the object precedes the qualities, just as it does for Husserl. I'm enough of a phenomenologist to say that the object is actually something different from its qualities, distinct from it, and prior to its qualities. Because Aristotle knew this. A substance can have different accidents at different times. Socrates can be happy today and sad tomorrow. It's still Socrates. We don't think of it as a different person just because his emotions changed. So anyway, we can have an argument about that if you want. But the point being that object-oriented ontology is really based on a gap between the object and its qualities. And a lot of people think OOO, object-oriented ontology, is only about withdrawal. And withdrawal is a term I use simply because it's Heidegger's term, and I wanted to show my debt to Heidegger by using that term. But that's only one of two basic distinctions in OOO. Along with the distinction between concealed and revealed, or withdrawn and presence, there's also the difference between the object and its qualities, which critics never talk about, but it's really central, just as central to OOO, this Husserlian distinction between an object and its qualities. My friend Hans and the exact angle of his hat and how far he is from me and how his face looks today, that is just as important for OOO as the one between withdrawn and concealed. And if you know some of my other books, you may know that's how I interpret Heidegger's fourfold. Heidegger's Geführt, which commentators simply ignored until recently because nobody knew what it was. It seems so strange and mystical. In my first book, I said this is really what it means. You get four things when you get an intersection of two dualisms. And this is the dualism in question: withdrawn, present, and object qualities. So let's talk a little more about objects and qualities, because this is the one that has to do with aesthetics and why aesthetics is so important for OOO. I'm teaching aesthetic theory right now at the university this semester. And one thing you'll find is that most aesthetic theorists treat the beautiful as the opposite of the ugly. I don't think the beautiful and the ugly are opposites. I think the beautiful and the ugly are cousins. They both are unusual forms of experience. It's just the beautiful is pleasant and the ugly is unpleasant. The true opposite of both of those, I say, is the literal. So what's the literal? Let me just look up a random sentence here on the internet from a news story. If I can get it to open, let's see. So I'm opening CNN here. That's not where I'll open ESPN. I'll read from a sports story. The Indianapolis Colts, that's American football team. The Indianapolis Colts and quarterback Daniel Jones reached agreement Wednesday on a 2-year, $88 million contract that can be worth up to $100 million. Okay, that's very informative, especially if you follow American football. That's a large contract they're giving to this player who is important to their team. But it's a literal statement. So you're learning information from that. There's nothing aesthetic about that statement. In order to get an aesthetic statement, what you need to do is find a way to make a split between the object and its qualities, because then the object becomes mysterious if it is treated as something more than its qualities. So the example I use in the book, Object-Oriented Ontology, is Homer. Homer's Odyssey, where Homer repeatedly talks about the wine-dark sea. Okay, that's recognizable as a metaphor. But the point of that metaphor is not to tell us that the Mediterranean Sea is the same color as wine, because Homer could have just said that if he wanted. Also, it's even if true, it's trivial, and it's probably not exactly true. You're never going to see a wine that is exactly the same color as the Mediterranean Sea. So what is really going on in that metaphor is that Homer is using the approximate identity of color as an excuse, as a pretext to assert an identity between the wine and the sea on other fronts. So when you say wine dark sea, that's a sea with wine qualities. And so you're probably not thinking of the color of the sea. You're probably thinking of the danger, the intoxication of being at sea, the forgetting when you're at sea, just as when you're drinking wine, and so forth. All of these other features of wine actually are assigned to the sea. That's what makes a metaphor so powerful. And of course, I'll say more about why in a second. Now, here's another point, which is that literal statements you can reverse. So I can say a pen is like a pencil. I can also say a pencil is like a pen. Doesn't matter which one I say first, right? Because you're just comparing the qualities of the pen and the pencil. They're long, they're skinny, they're cheap. They are used to make dark marks on white paper. So pen and pencil, that's a pretty convincing identity, but it's not a metaphor unless you have some ingenious Dadaist poets who find some way to make it work as a metaphor. A pen is like a pencil is like a pen, doesn't matter. But look at the wine dark sea again. You have wine dark sea and you have sea dark wine. Those are both metaphors, but they're different metaphors. They're not reversible. So wine dark sea, you're giving the wine qualities to the sea. Sea dark wine, you're giving the sea qualities to the wine. You're talking about wine in this case, not about the sea. And that is the first clue we have that objects are not just bundles of qualities, because it matters which place you put each of them in. It's like the difference between a noun and an adjective in grammar. And so, again, what the poet is trying to do is drive a wedge between the object and its qualities. So it's kind of an anti-Humean action to create a metaphor. You couldn't really have a Humean theory of metaphor that works, according to me. So let's give some more facts here about metaphors. Another thing about metaphors is that they don't work unless they're not too accurate or too inaccurate. So again, if I say a pen is like a pencil is like a pen, we don't recognize that as a metaphor because that's a literal statement. You are comparing the qualities. You're not thinking about the objects. So that's not a metaphor. If it's too distant, it's also not a metaphor because you're confused. The example I've always heard is drinking a milkshake is like drawing an isosceles triangle. It's a funny statement, but you can't really think of it as a metaphor because our mind is confused by that. How is drinking a milkshake anything like drawing an isosceles triangle? There's nothing at all to do. So that probably doesn't work as a metaphor either. Again, unless the poet is really a genius and somehow makes you believe it. I don't even know how that would happen. But with the wine dark sea, there's some resemblance, namely the color, but then you're forcing an added resemblance that isn't really there because of the color. The color becomes an excuse to identify two things that really aren't alike, other than the fact that they're liquids, they're dark liquids. Or another metaphor from Homer, Dawn with her fingertips of rose. Beautiful metaphor, Dawn with her fingertips. You can imagine that. Dawn is like a human with fingertips of rose, the rosy streaks that come up in the morning. You could also try to reverse that and say a rose with its fingertips of dawn. That's also a nice metaphor, but again, it's different because you're talking about roses, not about dawns. So this split between objects and their qualities is the key to aesthetic experience for OOO. And OOO says this is how all relations happen. All relations happen through something like a metaphorical relation. So even causality has to be interpreted in terms of a metaphorical relation. That when two things interact, even physically, there's something like a metaphorical structure at work. The object and its qualities become divided, and they interact in that way. And there are two precedents for that. Timothy Morton, in his book Realist Magic, made an argument like this back in 2013, I think he published that. But then even further back, in scholastic philosophy in the Middle Ages, there were some theories about objects only interacting with each other through their qualities, through their accidents. And that's not a surprise, because OOO follows in the line of Aristotle, as does scholasticism. And I am aware that Aristotle right now is probably the most out of fashion great classical philosopher. When I was a student in the 1990s, it was Plato who was out of fashion because of Derrida. Everyone was having to reverse Plato or undercut Plato. Everyone's saying, I'm not a Platonist. And then whatever happened, that flipped. Plato became not just a great philosopher, but also cool again. I think probably because Derrida started writing about the Timaeus and Cora, and some other authors in continental philosophy started writing about Plato. I would say right now, the two most unfashionable in cutting-edge continental philosophy are Aristotle and Husserl. Husserl is seen as kind of too old-fashioned to lead continental philosophy, and Aristotle is seen as, I've heard Aristotle blamed for Auschwitz by one scholar, which is really takes the cake. That really goes too far. But why do I like Aristotle and Husserl at the moment when they are not really in fashion? Because they both have this distinction I like between substance and accidents, or the object and its Abschattungen. We need to see that an object is not just its qualities. All right, so OOO has had a lot of success in other fields than philosophy, and that is often a good sign in the continental tradition. Right? In analytic philosophy, the best analytic philosophers are usually read only by other analytic philosophers, right? Probably no one's reading David Lewis unless they're interested in analytic philosophy. It's a very professional discourse that uses a lot of technical terminology. It is not meant to have a wide readership. These people see themselves as scientists. And just like a cutting edge paper in physics would probably not be readable by anyone who's not a physicist, the same for analytic philosophy, and they're proud of it. Continental philosophy by nature is a little more interdisciplinary and aims at a bit of a broader readership. This is why you'll find the public reading continental philosophy books. You won't usually find the general public reading analytic philosophy books unless it's Wittgenstein, maybe Richard Rorty, maybe Dennett, but it's a small number of authors. So OOO has done well with interdisciplinary fields, such as architecture, such as the arts, such as literary theory. And that's partly because Bruno Latour paved the way. Bruno Latour was a very interdisciplinary thinker, and since OOO is linked onto Bruno Latour now, a lot of the audiences that Latour opened up are somewhat receptive to OOO. But what is it about OOO that gives it a broad interest to people? It's because every field has to deal with this conflict between individual elements and the system as a whole. The way that individual elements can resist the system and push back against it. Here's an example I think of often with global warming. Sometimes people assume that global warming and the ecological crisis prove holism, proves that everything's linked because everything affects everything else. And so if you turn on your car, that affects the climate in Siberia or in Japan. Actually, I draw a different lesson from it. James Lovelock, the founder of Gaia theory, who died at age 102 or something a few years ago. Back in 2009, I happened to be giving lectures in Dublin, Ireland, at the same time that James Lovelock gave a lecture on the climate crisis in Dublin. So I was able to see him in person once. And he made an interesting point. He said, the climate change does not prove that everything's connected. It proves that three things are connected. And that's the danger. And the three things that are connected with the climate are the death of algae in the ocean, the melting of the permafrost in Siberia and Canada, and the death of the Amazon jungle. If those three things happen, we are truly doomed. But not every other little climate disaster necessarily leads to a catastrophe. It's those three things, basically. So really, I think what the climate crisis teaches us is not that everything is connected, but that certain things are really connected in a very dangerous way. And we have to identify the difference between what's connected and what's not connected. And if I have any objection to Bruno Latour's philosophy, it is that he makes connections too easy. Everything is connected to everything else. All the actors are connected in the network. In his later philosophy, I think he started to see the problem there, and he started to make connections a little more difficult. Because think of all the things that are nearby us at all times, and we don't connect with them at all. We know, I think the average person knows around 400 people. That's the most we can handle. And some of them we don't really interact with in any important way. Some of them change our lives. Why is that? Why is it that some interactions we have with people and things and places are just very, very minimal, superficial things, and some are like alchemy? They really change us, change the other person maybe. Well, it's because some connections occur and some don't. I wrote a book called Immaterialism that's not in Ukrainian. It's in some other languages, though, besides English. And I wrote that, it's called Objects in Social Theory, the subtitle, Immaterialism, Objects in Social Theory. What I wanted to do there was to give an alternative theory of how social objects interact, because I think in Latour's actor network theory, things interact too easily. And so I looked at the Dutch East India Company, which was the world's first corporation, founded around 1600s. And my thesis was that you can't understand the Dutch East India Company by just looking at the biggest battles it fought and the biggest business deals it made, because those are the things that were most important for the news. They weren't the things that were most important for the company itself. And so I was looking at what I called symbioses the company made. I don't know if Lynn Margulis is famous in the Ukraine. She's one of the great American scientists of the past half century. Lynn Margulis is an evolutionary biologist who died a decade or so ago, who made a challenge to Darwin, a very interesting challenge to Darwin, which is that she did not think evolution happened by gradual change of species. She thought it happened suddenly. And the reason she thought it happened suddenly is because she thinks two independent organisms form a symbiosis and become one organism. And that's when new life forms appear in evolution. So to give an example, back in the 1960s, when she was a graduate student, people were laughing at her theory. Her theory was that she predicted that human cells include some things that were originally parasites that were not supposed to be in human cells, and that over time they became part of the human cell. And this is the 1960s. So she said, we can't do this yet because we cannot analyze the DNA of a cell nucleus. But she predicts whenever we can do that, it will prove that some of these parts of the human cell came from outside as parasites. Well, this became possible in the 1980s. It became possible to analyze a cell nucleus, the DNA, in the 1980s. And it proved her completely right that human DNA does not have codes for a lot of the most essential parts of our cells. So these were bacteria or viruses that came into the cell originally as parasites, but then over time, the human cell made use of these parasites to enhance our own survival, to process oxygen and things like that. And we all know now that viruses can change DNA under many circumstances. And so really, the human creature is a kind of hybrids made up with this historical merger we made with all these different other creatures that originally were outside us. So maybe humans are actually a different species after COVID. And over time, we will see that COVID did some things to our cells that will prove to be beneficial in the long run, even if it makes many people sick now. We'll see. Anyway, I chose Margulis as my model because I thought social theory, social ontology needed something like that. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to interpret this Dutch East India Company, the first corporation, in terms of the symbioses it went through, which are irreversible symbioses it made with other entities. And I settled on 5 or 6. One of them came from the fact that the Dutch East India Company, which was in what is now Indonesia, was so far away from Amsterdam in the days when communication was so slow that they had to appoint an independent person to make decisions while in Indonesia. They couldn't take a ship all the way back to Amsterdam and ask them for advice on every question. So they created this person called the Governor General. And the Governor General was the person in Indonesia who would make the decisions about what to do, signing treaties, declaring wars, very big decisions. So that was the first symbiosis. The second symbiosis was that I think their fourth Governor General was this man named Jan Pieterszoon Koen. He was a very harsh man, the worst sort of imperialist or colonialist, but he made a very important decision. He wrote a little essay called Discourse on the State of India, and by India, he means the whole of Southeast Asia. This was a time when the Dutch were struggling for their independence from Spain. Spain had actually acquired the Netherlands through a royal marriage, and the Dutch were in revolts against Spain to keep their independence. So the only way they could possibly beat the Spanish, who were a massive military power, Dutch, a relatively small country then, was by earning an incredible amount of profit off sea trade to fund their navy. And Koen was very cold and clear-headed about how they could do this. He said, the only way we can do this is by attacking any other European power that wants to do spice trade in the East Indies. We're just going to have to ruthlessly fight the English and the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and whoever else, the Danish, whoever else tries to come there. But he said, even more than that, we have to force all the Asians to trade with us. They can't trade with each other. They have to trade with the Dutch only. Now, in Amsterdam, this made people very uncomfortable because Netherlands was already a very liberal country. Nobody liked to think of themselves as imperialist. But Koen said, this is the only way we can survive as a country. And the Netherlands didn't really act on it. They didn't want to have blood on their hands. And they recalled Koen to Amsterdam and replaced him with a more moderate person. But Koen was friends with this man. And before he left, he told him, here's what you have to do, like it or not. Invite all the British to a dinner and kill them all, because we cannot have peace with the British or the French or the Danish or the Spanish or the Portuguese, because if we do, we're going to lose 80% of our profits and Spain will conquer us. So just kill every other European. So his successor did exactly that. He invited all the British officials to a dinner and massacred them very coldly. And that led to a state of war between the Dutch and the British. But Koen thought that was the only way for the Dutch to survive as a country, because now they are fighting all the other countries, can keep all the spices for themselves and sell them for an incredible profit in Europe, since Europe had no other way to get the spices then. Okay, so those are two of the symbioses. There are two others, which are two locations they captured. One is where Jakarta is now. The other is in the north near Singapore. And then the final one was that around 1650, the Dutch East India Company realized they're making more money by trading inside Asia than they are by trading back and forth with Amsterdam. So they started focusing on smaller ships that can go up Asian rivers. They built a smaller navy and didn't go back to Amsterdam as much. So those are really the 5 steps that made the Dutch East India Company as incredibly profitable as it was. And then for many decades, the profits kept rising and rising and rising and rising. And then what happens in the early 1700s? Europeans lost interest in spices and became more interested in coffee, tea, and chocolates, which the British had better access to. And then you see the British Empire rising and the Dutch going into decline. And by the late 1600s, the Dutch aren't really an empire anymore. They're a small to medium-sized power in Europe. And England becomes the world power that we know it in history to be. So what I was trying to show in that book is that the relations between objects exist, but they come at a price. They're not always easy to make. It takes work for two objects to relate. And so we can't just be holists and assume that everything's connected to everything else with no further labor. Inherently, objects are cut off from each other. They're private. It's kind of like Leibniz's monads with no windows, except they, in my philosophy, they can make contact. It just takes some work. The other difference is that for Leibniz, monads only refer to natural things. Leibniz has a funny letter to Arnauld, where he's making fun of different things that aren't really objects, don't really have monads. He says a man has a monad, but a circle of men holding hands does not, because there's nothing natural about a circle of men holding hands. A diamond has a monad, but two diamonds glued together do not. which is a strange example because there's nothing especially natural about one diamond, right? The amount of cutting and polishing that has to be done, it's already not a very natural thing. But then the one that really interested me is he said, Leibniz said all the officers of the Dutch East India Company do not have a monad. And so I wrote this book to try to prove Leibniz wrong, that actually the Dutch East India Company is just as much an individual thing as a leaf or a dog. And I think that's important because Aristotle's tradition of substance philosophy has always favored nature. Whereas we today are much more interested in artificial things like airplanes, drones, insulin, computers, robots, all these things that do not occur in nature that we make, but that act as a single unit. And there's never really been a philosophy that did that. So that's the sense in which I think OOO is contemporary, that it is trying to develop a theory of technological artifacts as individual entities. So these are some of the things that are prominent themes in OOO. Should I stop now? It's 10:50. Should we move? And I have to also close this window because the building next to me is making too much noise. They're very rude about that.
I think you've got 10 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, I should talk about waves and stones because I haven't talked about
definitely.
Right, Waves and Stones. The first book, Object-Oriented Ontology, that was the first book I had done with Penguin, large British publisher. And they wanted me to do a second one. The first book was a success. So they asked me what I'd like to write about. And the reason I proposed Waves and Stones is because it's a book I wanted to read, but nobody had written it. So I said, I guess I'll have to write it because no one's ever thought of this. And that is the tension between the continuous and the discrete in pretty much every area of human study. And let me start with the two most famous that most of you have probably heard at some point. Obviously, first of all, physics has been in a kind of crisis for 120 years because the two pillars of contemporary physics, namely general relativity for gravity and quantum theory for everything else, are not compatible. They both work when you use them, but if you get down to a fine enough scale, they don't work. To give an example of why not, according to Einstein's general relativity, gravity bends space and time. Mass bends space and time. But the problem is, according to quantum theory, you can't know exactly where the mass is. You can only know with a certain probability where the particle is, which means only with a certain probability can you know where space and time are curved. But that doesn't work because general relativity is a classical theory. It doesn't make allowance for quantum effects. And so when you get certain cases like black holes, this becomes a very big problem. Although most of the time you can either use quantum theory or general relativity in its own area with no difficulty, and it's very accurate. But when you have to use them both, problems arise. And there have been so many different attempts to explain this, with string theory being one of them, but none of them really work. Now, if you read, there's a lot of good popular books on physics written by physicists, famous physicists. So you can buy books by Michio Kaku or Carlo Rovelli or Lisa Randall or any of these people who are top physicists. What they usually say is that quantum theory is good for explaining the very small things, and general relativity is good for explaining the very large things. That's actually not true. It's not a bad explanation, but it's not true. Quantum theory works for big things as well, and general relativity also works for small things. The real incompatibility, and I've had physicists admit this to me when I ask them, is that general relativity is a continuous theory, right? Space and time bend gradually, whereas quantum theory, everything happens in small jumps. So in quantum theory, if you raise the heat in your room, raise the temperature in your room, it's not going up continuously, it's going up in tiny jumps that are too small for the human skin to feel. So that tension between the continuous and the discrete is right there at the heart of contemporary physics, which for most secular intellectuals has replaced religion as the ultimate source of truth. So that's a big problem. The other one people may know has to do with evolution, where there's been this argument going on, not only with Lynn Margulis, who I just talked about, but also with Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, who had this theory of evolution as punctuated equilibrium, which is that instead of evolution happening gradually over millions of years, animal species stay stable, and then there's a usually a climate crisis, and they readjust very fast. So as soon as the dinosaurs were wiped out, mammals and birds evolved very quickly because they could come out of hiding. There were no dinosaurs to eat them anymore. And mammals and birds started taking over. And that's when you're going to see lots of changes in mammals. It's not equal over the whole history of mammals. It happens very fast right there. Then you have other cases like sharks that have barely changed at all in 300 million years. So they're obviously not going through small changes. Sharks must have had very large changes a few times in history. And that's opposed by Darwinians like Richard Dawkins, who stick to the model of very slow and gradual change. So that's an unanswered controversy. And then if you go through pretty much any area of the human study, you're going to find that same problem. You're going to find it in philosophy. So for instance, you have people like Bergson and Deleuze, for whom everything is a flux, Heraclitus, everything is like a river. But then you're going to find the occasionalists, like the Islamic occasionalists, or people like Malebranche and Descartes, where the universe has to be continuously recreated because the moments of time are disconnected from each other. So that's another version of the same problem. In mathematics, you have there's the continuum hypothesis made by Cantor, and then there's people who don't think it's true. I've got a chapter on history in the book, because you can think of cities as discontinuous pockets of civilization surrounded by wasteland. And then when you think of the nomads, especially the Mongols, these were people who hated cities. They wanted everything to be continuous pastoral land for grazing sheep. And so the first thing the Mongols usually would do is destroy cities, burn them to the ground, leave nothing but rubble. And so this is a conflict that passes through every human area. Now, what I noticed from going back through history, intellectual history, is that usually when philosophers try to deal with this problem, they do it by trying to reverse one to the other. So with a philosopher like Bergson, you're going to see him, to some extent, try to downplay the discretes and say, fundamentally, everything's a flow. And if things seem discrete, it's just because of some feedback loop, or it's because our human practical activity rewards us for thinking of things as individual objects, even though everything actually blends into everything else. And then the other side, although less popular, would again be these occasionalists who say, actually, nothing can touch anything else because they're totally discontinuous. So God has to make things happen. And each moment of time is not connected to the next moment of time. And even Whitehead has this idea that each moment of time is disconnected from the other two. And I don't think that works. I think the continuous and the discrete are both necessary elements of reality. It's a dualism. There are these two. And so the question isn't how to reduce one to the other. The question is how the two interact. And so in the book, I come up with some preliminary suggestions about how to make that possible. But it's really trying to give a lot of empirical examples of what an important problem this is. And it's remarkable how ignored it is, that even physicists, as I have said, speak of the problem in their field as the opposition between the very small and the very big, when that's actually not it at all. And if you talk to them, they will admit that I'm right about this. Now, what's interesting is that while I was writing the book, a certain physicist at University College London, Jonathan Oppenheim, finally put forward a theory that you're not going to be able to unify quantum theory and general relativity. General relativity will always be continuous, gravity will always be continuous, and quantum theory will always be discrete. And so there's this other way you do it. There's this other way you unify it. So he's saying something similar to me. And I'm not going to link my theory to Oppenheim because maybe his theory will be proven wrong. Maybe there's mistakes in it. But I raised that in the book to say that some physicists are seeing this as well. But then more interestingly, I discovered that Aristotle already was onto this as well. Aristotle's whole philosophy is built on the dualism of the continuous and the discrete. And my evidence for this, which I don't think any Aristotle scholar ever saw, you could say, what are the physics and the metaphysics about? Aristotle's two arguably greatest works. Well, you could say the physics is about nature and the metaphysics is about what's above nature. But that's just like saying science is about the very small and the very big. That's not quite it. Really, the physics is about the continuous and the metaphysics is about the discrete. And the way that works is the physics, the continuum is really Aristotle's main concept, right? In that book, Aristotle says, how many moments of time are in my lecture today? no definite number of instants of time, because time isn't made of tiny time units. Time is a continuous stretch. We can divide this lecture into 2 parts or 10 parts or 1,000,000 parts. It's up to us. It's completely arbitrary. Just like the number line, right? The number line, you can, how many numbers are there between 0 and 100? It depends on how you want to cut it up. Cutting is arbitrary. Okay, what about space? How many units of space are here in my living room? No definite number of units of space. It's just one undivided stretch called my living room, and I can cut it up mentally if I want to, but there's no definite numbers of space, definite number of pieces of space. Now, the reason this is important for Aristotle is because he's trying to refute Zeno's paradoxes, in which, for instance, you can never walk to the door because first you have to go halfway to the door, and then you have to go halfway between that point and the door, and then halfway again, and then halfway again. You're going to get closer and closer and closer to the door. You'll never reach the door. Aristotle's answer to that is there's not an actually infinite number of halfway points. There's a potentially infinite number of halfway points for our minds. We can arbitrarily point to those halfway points all the way to the door that never reach the door. But in reality, there's just one undivided motion between me and the door. So of course I'll reach the door. And that's his attempt to refute Zeno. Okay, then you go to the metaphysics and it's totally different. Because if I ask how many people are involved in this Zoom discussion, that's not arbitrary. I can't say, well, maybe there's 2 people here, or maybe there's 100 or 1,000,000. It's not arbitrary for the mind to choose how many people are here. There's a definite number of people here because we are all actually discrete from each other. We are not melted together into one giant human lump. We are individual people, and there's a definite number that can be counted. So that's where the discrete comes from in Aristotle. Substances. One other thing besides substances, which is he says qualitative change. That's an interesting argument. He says if there's a stone in a river and the river is eroding the stone does not lose an equal number of particles in every instant of time. For a long time, nothing happens, and then suddenly, poof, a chunk of the stone breaks off. You could go many years in philosophy with nothing happening. And then suddenly, oh, here's Immanuel Kant. Now there's all this stuff happening in Germany because Kant triggered all these other philosophers, Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, to do these other things. And that triggered Marx and so on. So qualitative change does not happen equally at all moments. So that's also discrete for Aristotle. But the other things, time, space, number, and motion, are all continuous. And Aristotle just says we have to find a way to live with both of those. You can't reduce one to the other. So again, it's really an Aristotelian idea, but I'm trying to improve the account of how those 2 interact. And I don't think I've mastered it in the book, but I did set the table for it. And I hope to get people talking about it. So now it's 11:01. Maybe I'll stop.
Great, thanks a lot. That was amazing. That was just a lot of things to think about, I guess, for all of us. Okay, and we've got some questions already, but I guess we're going to start with the questions from the Google form, if nobody minds, right? And the first one was about this beautiful person who is writing a diploma, a thesis about object-oriented ontology, and this is the question. I'm interested in the status of myth in this concept. Thus, I want to develop my ideas. In your opinion, what is the place of myth in the object-oriented ontology? Does it have any exceptional status?
Fascinating. I'm very interested in the concept of myth. I have to admit that I've never written about this in the concept of object-oriented ontology. So you are a pioneer. You will be the expert on that. You will be the world's expert. You will know more about this than I do as soon as your diploma thesis is finished. One of the things I like about myth is that, first of all, a myth usually has multiple variants, which shows to me that it's kind of an object-oriented way of saying that the core of a story is deeper than any of its specific details. So if we find out that there's 10 different versions of the Oedipus myth in ancient Greece, what that tells us is that the story itself is somehow something independent from the individual version portrayed by Sophocles or by whatever other playwrights may have done it. And I remember Ray Bradbury, the American science fiction writer, I don't know if he's known there, saying that when he writes stories, he tries to create myths because myths tend to endure in a way that even stories don't. And so there is something kind of mythical about the way he writes his popular short story tales. And so he has one, it's called Something Wicked This Way Comes. And it's popular science fiction, but it really affects people deeply. It's about this traveling circus that comes to a town, and circus myths are already abundant. And there's a carousel. And if you get on this carousel, every time it goes around once, you become 1 year older. And if it goes backwards, you become 1 year younger. And there's one case where a man gets on it and it spins really fast and he becomes 125 years old very quickly. So they have to reverse it. Then there's a character called the Illustrated Man who has tattoos on his body, but the tattoos move and you ask him a question. And the tattoos tell a story. And then finally, this carnival is in a small town. You could easily walk around this small town, but they travel with a hot air balloon instead. Even though they could easily walk, the balloon comes up from the circus and travels to someone's house. There's something very archetypal about all of those. And then I also I haven't read the whole thing, but I like reading James Fraser's The Golden Bough, one of the classics of anthropology, where he talks about that myth where some people might not know it, that there's a lake south of Rome and there's a sacred tree there. And any escaped criminal could take over the tree and stand there, and they could not be arrested or punished. But any other criminal could come and kill them and take over the status. And so Fraser tries to analyze this myth, and he tries to link it to the history of magic and the history of mythology. And of course, here's another thing I like about myths. Myths are deeper temporally than even what we recognize as our own civilization. So if we think of, say, the United States as a basically Christian civilization in terms of its foundations, still a lot of our myths are very anciently pre-Christian. And it's interesting to look at what those are. We have Halloween, this holiday that I think comes from Scotland and Wales, and it has to be pre-Christian, right? The fact that children wear these scary costumes and go out asking for candy. Or when I was teaching in Egypt, one of the great things about teaching in Egypt is you get all the holidays. You get all the American holidays, all the Egyptian holidays, all the Christian holidays, all the Muslim holidays, because they don't want to offend anybody there, right? There's also one holiday called Sham Nassim in Egypt, which is actually from the pharaohs of Egypt. It's a festival for the beginning of spring. And even though Egypt's a very Muslim country, they still celebrate this holiday that's not celebrated in the other Muslim countries because it's an Egyptian holiday. It has to do with the planting of the food in ancient Egypt. And so that's obviously very, very ancient compared to current Egyptian civilization, but it lasts a very long time. And I'm sure a good anthropologist could find all kinds of stuff that's like that, that's earlier than the current civilization. My wife is Turkish, and a lot of Turkish really believe in the evil eye. You know, that blue eye, it's there to protect you from envy. I don't know if that's in Ukraine at all, but it is. Oh, okay. It originally comes from the Turks when they were living in Mongolia, when they were following shamanism and casting spells on people, and before they were anywhere near Europe. And they just kept that. Even after they converted to Islam, they kept this very ancient pagan belief in the evil eye. And so you find things like that all around the world that last. And so these are some of the things that interest me about myths. And I'm sure I'm missing some major issues that this student has probably come up with. If they want to say anything to me now, I'd love to hear it. Or if they want to send me an email, I'd love to hear it. I encourage you 100% to work on this project.
Great, thanks a lot. So the student in question has heard the the ideas, and let us the second question would be from our colleagues from Kharkiv, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I am. And here is the very long but a very important question. If object-oriented ontology gives priority to object relations and suggests that real change occurs primarily at the level of infrastructures and technologies rather than ideology, what role remains for collective human agency that articulates the social demand for such transformations? Could the model of love as a practice that respects the autonomy of objects be extended from an individual ethical stance to a form of political responsibility or collective action, a kind of political love for the modern human world? In other words, why is love framed mainly in individual terms, for example, the love of Dante to Beatrice, rather than as a collective attachment of eco-socially oppressed masses to the planet expressed through forms of anti-capitalist, ecological, and social activism? Yeah.
Excellent question. And also, long live Kharkiv. You've put up with a lot of bad things there, and I hope you and your family are safe now and always. As for the question, yeah, you're right that in the book Dante's Broken Hammer, I did focus on individual love, and you have a really good idea here. I didn't talk about collective love, even though collective love is what holds people together. There have to be certain things that hold them together, and it's different in different countries. So yes, that might be a way to I'm planning to write a book on politics in the near future, and as this questioner seems to realize, most of what I've said about politics so far, I wrote a book called Bruno Latour, Reassembling the Political. And modern politics, of course, is organized around the difference between left and right. You meet somebody, you can guess pretty well after a few minutes how far left or how far right they are, or if they're in the center. And you can probably be pretty accurate, although there are some times that are confusing. We have actually a few leftists who support Trump in this country, which is, I wouldn't have predicted. But if you look at the origin of left and right, these aren't very old. These only go back to the time of the French Revolution, and they refer to the two different sides of the assembly. And what it boils down to is two opposite theories of human nature. So for the left, and here we can think of Rousseau, Marx, and in a different sense, John Locke. The left basically thinks of humans as good or at least improvable, and that if we do not have a good political situation, it's somebody's fault. Either it's society's fault, as in Rousseau, or it's the fault of greedy capitalists, as in Marx, or it's the fault of tyranny, as for Locke. But basically, humans could fix things and make a pretty good situation because we are naturally equal, according to Rousseau. Whereas the right has the opposite intuition. People like Hobbes and Machiavelli and Schmitt, humans are naturally dangerous. If you leave humans to their own devices, they will steal and rape and kill and invade. And so we should feel lucky we have a government that's tough and punishes criminals severely and attacks our enemies severely, because that's the only thing that keeps us safe. Well, even though those seem like opposites, what they have in common is that both are theories of human nature at the bottom. Now, what if humans are not really the only or even the main topic of politics? And this is something I learned from Latour. And Latour learned this in part from Shirley Strum, who's a primatologist in California. She studies different apes. And Latour went with her somewhere to study baboons. And what he noticed there is that baboons are even more social than humans. Baboons are always watching each other to see what the political hierarchy is, because it can change. Which baboons are grooming which baboons? Which baboons are the dominant ones today? Which ones are getting a little weaker? And if the other baboons walk away, the baboon has to go follow them, even if it has to leave a food source, because it can't stand to be away from the rest of the society. And humans are a bit like that, because humans are social animals too, but not completely, right? Because when I wake up in the morning, I know my name, I know my government identification number, I know who I'm married to, I know my job, I know how much money I have in the bank, I know that my wife and I are the only ones with the key to this apartment who can get in. No one else is allowed in unless we let them. These are all inanimate objects that give me a certain security that I have. There's a legal code somewhere that prevents people from hurting me, or they'll be punished if they hurt me, and so on. And so that made me start looking at non-human objects that shape the political space. And of course, with global warming, we have ample examples of that. Even if humans caused global warming, as I believe, and most people believe, we have things like carbon dioxide and methane becoming very important political actors in the world, and we're going to have to deal with them. the ozone hole. Now, if you go back in political history, this has always been known by some people, but it's been linked to certain things like geography, right? That certain countries seem to be natural friends or natural enemies because how they're located with respect to each other. Here's one. England is an island. Because they're an island, they're not in danger of being invaded. It's very hard to invade England. It hasn't happened since the Normans in 1066, almost 1,000 years ago. And so England is probably destined to be a naval power, not a land army power. It makes no sense to have a large land army. It makes a lot of sense to have a big navy for England, which is what they've had for centuries. And then the United States, the same, because even though the United States is not really an island, the United States is neighbors with Canada and Canada and Mexico have been not as strong as the United States for a very long time, and so they're not a threat. So we don't need a lot of soldiers on our borders with those countries, and we focus on having a very large navy that has ports all around the world. And then something about naval powers is the forms of government tend to be more liberal because island naval powers are by definition a little bit safer. And so they tend to share more information with the public. They tend to let the public engage in more commerce without taxing it as heavily. Whereas countries like France and Germany and Russia tend to build up very large land armies. And now Ukraine's got a large land army too, because you have neighbors who are potentially very dangerous. And there are wars with these neighbors throughout history. So that's one way in which geography can cause destiny for certain countries. And another island power, Japan isn't allowed to say that they have a navy. They call it a coast guard, but it's apparently the second largest navy in the world after the United States. Because again, Japan is not going to be invaded by land, so they can afford to have a large naval force. Okay, now the problem with that is the left doesn't like geographical interpretations of history because it sounds like geographical determinism, and the left these days likes to talk about all it takes is for all of us to come together and imagine and make a decision for a better world. We don't have to listen to the determinism of geography. But I think geography teaches us some lessons. I'm reading a book now by Admiral Mahan from the US Navy back in the late 1800s, a period when the United States did not have a strong Navy. And he's making the argument that the United States is destined to be a naval country, should build up a big Navy. And that's exactly what happened. And of course, he's one of the people who influenced the decision to conquer Hawaii before it was an American state, to overthrow the Queen and take over Hawaii, because it's not a nice thing to do, but it was a good move in terms of national security, and it was essential in fighting Japan in World War II. So, but then there are other things, right? The fact that American politics has been completely changed by social media. Donald Trump would not have been elected without social media. And some of you may know about this, but the way it works is that social media's main goal is to keep people involved for as long as possible. Well, the main way to keep people involved on social media is either to tell them things that make them feel they're right or tell them things that make them angry. And so if you're a political liberal or a political conservative, you're going to see very different things on social media because they want to keep you happy. And so if you look at a political conservative's Facebook, you're going to see a lot of stories about immigrants committing crimes, about Black people committing crimes, about how corrupt Bill and Hillary Clinton are, that Obama is secretly gay. These are the kinds of things conservatives see on their Facebook messages, whereas a political liberal like me is going to see a lot of messages about how the police killed another Black driver by beating him to death. Corporations are stealing money from consumers. You're going to get messages that reinforce what you already believe. And this has shaped the American political space into a very polarized space. So that's another example of a non-human actor that has really shaped things. And then artificial intelligence. And I'm sorry, I got to run off and use the bathroom for a second. Is it okay? And then we can pick up this topic again.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
We're going to look through the questions while.
Yeah, I was also going to address one other part of that question I remembered. Could the model of love as a practice that respects the autonomy of objects be extended to the collective? Yes. And climate change may be an example of that. I think this also happens generationally. This is one of the reasons generations are different. Generations have different loves. And of course, the younger generation has much more to lose from climate change. I probably won't live to see the worst of it. And so my generation and the older generations probably aren't going to be the ones to save the situation. We probably need a new generation of political leaders to take this more seriously. And that's just one example of many. I think you find in any nation things that inspire incredible passion in that nation alone. Certain things that are patriotic causes in certain countries that may surprise you, but they're very important for that country and that collective for certain reasons. And then, of course, you can build up international ones, as has happened. And the climate should be something capable of doing that. So I don't know if that was a satisfying answer, but I do want to say that this person is right, that in that book, I focused too much on the model of individual love. And I hadn't even really thought of doing more with the collective kind, but that's a hole in the book. It's true. Okay.
Incidentally, while we are discussing the application in practical philosophy of, I would like to ask you the following. So, in one of the recent interviews, you were asked about the Israel and Palestine through the lenses of object-oriented ontology, that both parties reject the legitimacy of other, or for instance, Arab nations reject the Israel as object, or at least as a legitimate object, and in Israel, a lot of people reject Palestine as a legitimate object, but they at the same time recognize something that they are dealing with. This made me think about the case of propaganda against Ukrainian state, and the ways how overmining and undermining your concepts can be applied to analyze this propaganda. So undermining is like what is the way to delegitimize object through reducing it to what it is made of, and overmining to reduce it to what it does, the object. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking that, for instance, undermining concerning the nation would be, for instance, as Russian propaganda says, that, okay, there is no Ukraine as real object, real nation. It's only like just confused individuals who don't know that they are really just Russians or something. And there are some like NATO puppeteers who influence these people. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, there can be like overmining, like saying that, okay, people are just confused because of the ideology, so this kind of relational things, or even just as relation to other nations, like NATO projecting power into, again, like rejecting legitimacy of object as Ukraine as a real object. And so, yeah, I wonder, would you say this kind of application is legitimate way to use your ontological scheme?
Yeah, yes, you could use it as a critique of propaganda. I hadn't thought about that. Is it undermining, or I guess it would be overmining when they say Ukrainians are fascists and we have to fight a war against fascism. And then it turns out the percentage of fascists in Ukraine is less than Russia, France, or Germany, or maybe even America now. Yeah, you could call that a kind of overmining, I think. Interesting. I'd actually never thought of using it as a form of ideology critique, but I could do that maybe. Yeah. Ukraine-Russia seems to be a different case from Israel-Palestine, because Israel-Palestine, the two sides make the same arguments about each other, I've noticed. I spent 16 years in the Arab world. I also have Israeli friends. And for instance, both sides will say force is the only language that the other side understands. So in Egypt, I'd see students with a T-shirt with a gun on it saying the only language Israelis understand. And then I hear Israeli, like Netanyahu will say force is the only language the Arabs understand. Or when the October 7th attack happened, all of my Egyptian friends on Facebook were saying, you can't arbitrarily say that history began on October 7th. This is a response to other things. Well, Israel now will say, you can't arbitrarily say that history started when we bombed Gaza. There were things before that that caused it. Or the other one is, this disturbed me, both sides. The Egyptians I knew were saying, there is no such thing as an Israeli civilian because they all get military training, so we didn't kill any civilians. And then the Israelis said, everyone in Gaza supports Hamas, even if they're not part of it, so none of them are innocents. And so it's the same language back and forth. With Ukraine and Russia, it's asymmetrical because the things that Putin is saying are not the things that you are saying, right? So it's a very different situation. And boy, I'm still shocked. No one could have said, I never would have expected 10 years ago that this could happen. The Ukraine invasion, I mean, I could never have believed this would have happened. It seemed like science fiction. I could not have believed it would happen in the real world. I know from my other friends in Eastern Europe that there was always a fear of Putin. My friends in Poland, my friends in Estonia. It never felt real to me, but I guess they felt something that I didn't. Anyway, I feel for all of you, and I hope you are all safe. And your friend who is in the military service now, I hope he comes home safe, and that you all have, I hope it's a tragedy, but I hope this ends up being a forge of national identity for all of you. That it's something you can be proud of, that all the American experts on television was saying Ukraine will only last 4 days, Russia's too strong. And here you are. Amazing.
Thank you. That's very nice to hear from you. Thanks a lot.
Sure.
Okay, so it's time to go to our chat questions finally. Thanks everyone who have added something there. And we're going to start with Irina. And I guess let's pick up one question from Irina. And the second one interests me more. And as well as I have power over this chat, I will ask it. Okay, when we use a noun, we point to an object. When we use an adjective, we point to a quality. Does language inherently betray OOO by forcing us to separate things that are ontologically fused?
This case is made a lot that somehow Indo-European grammar distorts reality into the shape that grammar wants it to have. We have a linguist in America named Benjamin Lee Whorf, who died in the 1940s, who wrote a famous essay about how language shapes our view of the world, and that the Hopi Indians in Arizona actually have the best language for understanding quantum theory. So that's an example of that kind of case. But no, I don't think so. And the reason I don't think it's being shaped by grammar here is that I'm being shaped by a theoretical insight, by phenomenology, by Husserl's point, or earlier Aristotle's point, that we at least think of an object as the same object, even though it changes its qualities. Now, you could say, well, just because we think of it that way doesn't mean it's true, right? That maybe things are different every time they change their qualities. But there's a couple of problems with that. One of them is that that's just not how we experience, right? We experience self-identical objects changing their qualities and changing their place. So at least in terms of human experience, that seems to be how our nervous system carves up the world. I guess you could claim our nervous system made an arbitrary decision too. But another thing that you lose if you say that objects are just bundles of qualities is you lose the ability to distinguish between important changes and unimportant changes. And I think this is what happens to Latour's actor network theory when he analyzes historical events. Because also for Latour, like for Hume, anytime an actor links with another actor, it essentially becomes a different actor because its properties have changed, its relations have changed. But that could mean that if a hair falls off my head, my life has changed. And if I move to Japan and start speaking Japanese instead of English, my life has changed. Well, those are two very different levels of seriousness, however. And that's what I was trying to get at in my book on the Dutch East India Company, that there are lots of actions that the company is involved in, but there are only a small number of things that actually change the nature of the company itself. And those involve 2 locations on the map, the use of smaller ships in 1650 from then on, and this one governor general who wrote a treatise saying we have to attack all the other Europeans. Those were the most important things for the nature of the company. Whereas I think Latour loses that. Latour can just say, well, Louis Pasteur is relatively more important than other French doctors of the 1860s because they all changed the world somehow. Okay, but Pasteur completely changed the way in which hygiene and refrigeration and all of these other things happen, and vaccination, all these things happen. That's a completely different change. Whereas the others are more just managing the current situation and making local changes. And so I think bundle of qualities theories or bundle of action theories lose the capacity to make the distinctions we need between true events and small things that happen. And this is one of the things I like about Badiou, a philosopher I don't agree with about a lot. I like the fact that he's able to theorize the difference between big events and mere situations where nothing really happens, that history is fairly rare, that only certain things matter. And that's been criticized as too heroic and undemocratic, but I think at least for intellectual history, it's a pretty good map of what happens. You can have decades when nothing really changes in a field, and then suddenly everything's different. You can have decades of inaction on climate change, and then suddenly civilization might be completely reorganized around climate change. We don't know. In the United States, there was originally very significant support for the Vietnam War, and then suddenly it was gone. Suddenly the public was against it. So I think discrete jumps do happen in history. There are certain events that change things in radically new ways. And so I think this is why I would say that nouns and adjectives aren't naturally fused. I think there's a reason they're 2 separate parts of speech.
How is the situation with the time? And do you still have time to answer questions?
Oh, I sure do. Yeah.
So I would like to ask one of the questions from chat, which reminded me of my own interest, and it goes like this. So the person says, "Dear Graham, one of your most brilliant ideas is that knowledge is not enough to work with reality, and the science is not only approach. How do you think? What are alternative epistemology approaches, and how to verify their results?" Thank you.
I would say not everything is verifiable to the same degree. And aesthetics is one case of that I can't give you a list of criteria to explain why Raphael is a great painter, that you can follow those criteria and then agree with me that he meets those criteria. You have to stand in front of the painting and have an aesthetic experience. And this is one thing Kant gets right in the Critique of Judgment, that it's you don't judge works using concepts. You have to have an aesthetic appreciation for the work that cannot be fully put in words. There's some words that can be used to make things easier. I think we have made a mistake by letting mathematics and the natural sciences be the model for all forms of knowledge, because we can see why Einstein's equations work. We can't see why such and such a person is the best literary critic of Shakespeare. And we might not even agree on who the best critic of Shakespeare is. There might be some disagreement, but generally speaking, there will be a sort of consensus when it comes to things that are not exactly measurable like that. I think people do that because people think mathematics and natural science require accuracy, and if you make a mistake, everybody can see you're wrong. whereas aesthetic and literary critics can bullshit and no one ever can prove that they're wrong. That's not really how it works, though. People who are in those fields generally build up a rough consensus of who's the best at those things. You just need more experience. And the more experience you have looking at works of art or architecture or reading literature, the better your taste is going to become. So I've been at an architecture school now for 10 years. When I came, I didn't really have a very developed sense of architecture, but my taste now is a lot better by just looking at a lot more architecture, talking to architects, reading more about the fields. And no, it will never be as exact as a mathematical proof, but it is a cognitive reality that some architectural works are better than others, and there's some disagreement between people on exactly how to rank them. But you should probably see that Le Corbusier is an important architect, even if he's not your favorite. And if you say that he's not, and you prove some other middlebrow architecture instead, you're showing your lack of qualification to judge an architecture. I would also point out that even in mathematics and the natural sciences, judgment is sometimes made this way. So, for instance, Thomas Kuhn talks about paradigm shifts and how paradigm shifts don't happen because of the cumulative weight of arguments. They're like Gestalt shifts. Suddenly, one scientist or a small number of scientists says it has to be this way. And that intuition probably outruns the arguments they have at first. At first, it's probably an instinct or a hunch. Like that, once Einstein proved that light speed is the fastest speed anything can happen, he had a hunch. He knew that Newton's theory of gravity had to be wrong, because Newton's theory of gravity involves gravity working at infinite speed. So Einstein had to start working on his own theory of gravity. And a couple of times he was wrong. He thought he had the solution, but then the solution didn't work. But then finally he got the solution. And also the way he thought he knew it was right was that the equations were so beautiful, he said. And if you want to, who talks about beauty today? It's not artists and architects. It's scientists and especially mathematicians who say this is so beautiful, it has to be true. The equation is so perfect, it has to be true. And Sabine Hossenfelder, the German physicist, has written a book against this. She thinks it's gone too far. It's called Lost in Math. She wants to focus more on experiments proving stuff. But mathematicians in particular are always looking not just for a proof of a theorem, but the most beautiful possible proof of a theorem, the simplest and most beautiful, most elegant. And I hear mathematicians talk about beauty more than people in any other fields. And so they're using aesthetic criteria, which aren't strictly logical ones. And that's very interesting. And Zizek makes that funny remark that it used to be that artists talked about beauty and scientists talked about reality. But now you buy a science book, like say you buy Brian Greene's book, The Elegant Universe, which is about string theory. He's talking about the elegance of the theory. And then in art, you've got Damien Hirst, who puts a dead cow in a gallery and brings all the flies in and electrocutes them. This is his artwork. It's not beautiful at all. It's disgusting. But this is art giving us a direct confrontation with the harshness of reality, electrocuting flies as his artwork. So it's kind of flipped. It's funny how that's flipped. And that tends to happen in history, that people reverse their qualities. So I'm deeply committed to that idea that we have to, one of the issues with modernity is we have given mathematics and the hard sciences and logic a monopoly on the criteria of truth. And analytic philosophy has slipped on this quite a bit. You see, there's even an essay by David Lewis where it's almost embarrassing. He's flattering the sciences and talking about how he wouldn't dare correct a scientist on anything. It's almost like he's begging for their favor. And it's a little embarrassing because David Lewis is one of the great analytic philosophers ever. The analytic philosophers call him the greatest metaphysician since Leibniz. I wouldn't go that far, but he's very good at what he does. And here he is just bending on his knees before the mighty sciences and apologizing for even criticizing them a little bit. I don't think we need to do that. I think we need to see that there are multiple criteria of truth. And of course, I think that for philosophy and not just aesthetics. And why do I think that for philosophy? Because philosophy is not a form of knowledge. It's not supposed to be a science. Philosophy is philosophia. It's love of wisdom. There's a certain negative principle built into it. The fact that Socrates is ignorant, that only a God knows All that Socrates knows is that he knows nothing. He's never been anyone's teacher. These are not just sarcastic remarks. Philosophy has a certain inadequacy built into it, a certain coming up short. And, people make fun of negative theology a lot and say, oh, you're just saying what a thing is not. That's just negative theology. If people go back and read negative theology from the Middle Ages, it's wonderful stuff. Pseudo-Dionysius, he talks about the Trinity. He gives the best explanation of the Trinity I've ever heard. I don't believe in the Trinity, but Pseudo-Dionysius says, if you think of the Trinity as you're in one house and there's one light coming from three lamps, but you don't know which part of the light is coming from which lamp because all the light is merging into one, that's a brilliant metaphorical description of how the Trinity would work. It's not cognitively worthless. It gives the best explanation possible. It doesn't convince me, but it gives me the best explanation I've ever heard of how the Trinity would work. And it's not just negative. It's a metaphorical theology. And the people who criticize negative theology are usually just giving a positive theology. Instead, they're saying, here's the way the world is, because this is what science and logic show. Therefore, I know it to be true. And actually, they don't know it to be true. We don't know if we know what the smallest particles of matter are. We don't know if there are smallest particles of matter. We don't have a final theory of physics. We probably thought mathematics was done by the mid-1800s, and then look, Cantor discovered all the different sizes of infinity, and set theory was discovered, and complex numbers were discovered earlier than that. So the sciences, I think, are at their best when they're negating things that are thought to be true rather than proving things that are true. And Popper knew this, and Kuhn knows this, and Lakatos knows this, so I'm certainly not the first one to say it. That in a way, what science does is moves us away from past theories instead of moving us toward the truth. It's negating things that we used to think. And it so far has always ended up being wrong at the next stage. And this is why scientific revolutions will probably never stop. Mathematics seems a little different, right? Because Euclid's geometry is still accurate if you accept the axioms that Euclid had. But what we found is you can keep expanding the axioms to things we never thought possible. Like your axiom can say parallel lines do meet. Euclid was wrong. So what does a non-Euclidean geometry look like? Or there's non-commutative geometry where triangle ABC equals triangle DEF, but triangle DEF does not equal triangle ABC, which seems illogical. But you can build any mathematical system you want simply by changing the axioms. And so there's really no final result even in those fields. And my final point would be, I don't think philosophy should be following in lockstep with the sciences because we are following different constraints. And so let's say a philosopher says, Aristotle was right, the universe is eternal. And someone says, that's not possible. Physics tells us there was a Big Bang. Well, there's some dissent on that now. Who knows what physics is going to say in 50 years? Physics is constrained by physical evidence. The times when philosophy is shaped by science is usually in a negative sense, right? Like we believe something, and then because of science, we think it's no longer a plausible option. So for instance, in Neoplatonism, a lot of Neoplatonists thought that the planets are divine beings and that they're transmitting messages to each other by speaking to each other. Well, no philosopher is going to say that now because science seems to have clarified that the planets are pieces of rock or gas that are not divine beings. Or Aristotle thought all the species were eternal, and we're not going to say that now because of Darwin. So sometimes in negative respects, we will, in philosophy, be shaped by the sciences, but not in positive respects. I don't feel bound to agree that light speed is the fastest speed. I might be able to have something in my philosophy where things affect each other instantly. I don't believe that, but I could, because I don't have to follow Einstein as a philosopher. Physicists do. These are different fields. They have different criteria of truth and reality. And Carlo Rovelli, the Italian physicist, has been saying this, that he's tired of philosophers just coming along and explaining why old scientific discoveries are right. He wants philosophers to start taking risks again. And philosophers have become pretty afraid to take risks when it comes to the sciences. the sciences are wrong because such and such a theory works logically better. And that is risky, but I would like the sciences, I would like philosophy to not be sycophantic to the sciences, as even someone like David Lewis is.
Okay, great. Thank you for answer. So we've got just a few minutes more until it's 9 p.m. in Ukraine, and everybody needs to go to sleep, apparently. So a couple of more questions, Vasil, or just one last? And Professor Harman, what do you think? Yeah? Okay. So we've got a question about opponents in the Google form, and quite a similar question in the chat, yes, posed by Volodymyr, I guess. So what does OOO aspire to become, and what is currently standing in its way, or who do you see as the main opponents of object-oriented ontology?
Yes. Well, ironically, the main opponents are probably the other branches of speculative realism. Speculative realism, I wish still existed. I enjoyed having conversations with Meillassoux and Brassier and Ian Hamilton Grant, but it fell apart very fast. Some for philosophical reasons, some for personal reasons. But I missed the group. So those are Meillassoux more does his own thing. He doesn't publish as much as I would like him to do, but he'll probably come out with other really important books. He may already have them written. Brassier is a little more hostile to me, and so he will say negative things about me in print, and sometimes I'll say negative things back. But probably his circle, I consider my main opponent. But then the other thing, probably OOO should come into more dialogue with analytic philosophy, because you can reach a certain level of influence where certain people are reading you and taking you seriously, but other people are just able to ignore you. So I would say right now, analytic philosophers are able to ignore me because I'm not writing their language. I'm not in their worlds. They can just say I'm writing poetry, or I'm not making rigorous arguments or something like that, because I don't make them in the style that they make. So I think I would at least like to invade their space enough that they have to respond to me by rewriting some of my arguments as articles for analytic philosophy journals and deliberately oppose some of the things that they're saying, so that they may at least feel the need to fight back a bit. Then you have a bit more visibility in more universities with OOO, because it's, I always tell people I had to go all the way to Egypt for my first job and all the way to architecture for my second. It would be very, very hard for me to be hired by a university philosophy department in the United States. I might never do that because analytic philosophers aren't going to hire me. I don't speak their language, and continental philosophers don't like me because I say they're wrong about everything. So I'm kind of then in the same position that Whitehead would be in, which is that he's not really studied by analytic or continental philosophers, except a few Deleuzians. He's mostly read in theology departments. I'm mostly read in art and architecture departments, and that has its own rewards. I've enjoyed getting to know artists and architects and writing about them and for them. But yeah, I think I would like to become more visible in academic philosophy, and I'm the one who's going to have to do that. They're not going to come read OOO at places like Harvard and Princeton. So I will have to take the initiative of challenging them in their own language. And that means I need to catch up a little bit on what I know about analytic philosophy, because I wasn't educated that way. I only know bits and pieces of it. So that's what I'm trying to do now, is I'm trying to give myself a fast education in contemporary analytic philosophy. So
great. So you're at least safe in Ukraine, because as one of the people in chat says, at least 3 professors at Kharkiv universities teach courses on your philosophy. So
that is wonderful. And I can't tell you how bad I feel sitting here. Okay, the United States is fighting Iran, but nothing's happening here in Los Angeles, and you guys are being attacked. And here I am talking to you, and you're facing actual danger, and I'm not. And I wish I were there speaking to you in person. And maybe someday I can sneak across and speak to you in person. I think Lviv is not so hard to get into now, right? There's some danger, but I can go from Poland.
Of course, yeah.
I would love to do that.
Very welcome.
I'd have to convince my wife to let me go, but I would love to come. Would love to come and show my support to what you people are going through, and I'm sure it's one tragedy after another, but when this is over, you're going to remember this is the moment when Ukraine was really born as a nation, and the respect in which you are held by the world now. Wow. Even Henry Kissinger, our dead diplomat now, who thought that Ukraine's destiny was to be a border state with Russia, totally changed his mind and said Ukraine has demonstrated that it's a major power and deserves a major voice, that you may have the best army in Europe now, probably. So congratulations on everything you've been through. I want you all to be safe. And I read about your situation every day. And you are all loved and respected and admired. Please take care of yourselves. Slava Ukraini.
Thanks a lot. Okay,
Героям
so
слава.
I guess this is the end of our session, and we really appreciate your willingness to talk to us, and that was very productive. I guess all the people, sorry not to ask all the questions, but you know that
Okay.
the time is also a matter here, and we hope that we will find answers in all the other books that are going to be translated. I don't know if by contra-publishing, probably yes, maybe no, we'll see. Yes, and yeah, at the end, we actually had a very positive note to finish with the last question about people who inspire you, or basically who should we translate?
Well, someone who inspires me who's not getting enough attention is Tristan Garcia. And Measu had told me about his great student, Tristan Garcia, years earlier. And since Measu made such a huge explosion when he first appeared in America, I assumed that would be the same with Tristan Garcia, because we love French philosophers in America. We can't get enough of them. But Garcia has had very limited impact so far, even though he's published 4 wonderful books in English already of just a philosophy. He also has novels. And I think it's because Garcia also does not start with the Kantian transcendental argument as the basis of his philosophy. And continental philosophers in America don't know how to interpret that. This is the problem they have with OOO also. But I think his book, Form and Object, and then he's got a new one called Letting Be and Making Possible. I assume you have someone in the house who can translate French. That's where I would go. And of course, Measu is after Finitude. That probably is already in Ukrainian, right?
Yeah, we've done it
Okay.
a year ago.
Okay, great. That would be my first answer.
Great, thanks a lot. Okay, good. So we have to work on that. And thank you again, Professor Harman. And thanks to all the people who came to listen and post their questions. And I hope that was interesting. And yeah, so yeah, we wish you all the best and have a great day in Los Angeles. And we're going to have a great night in Ukraine, I hope. Yes, and yeah,
hope
all the
so.
best. Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. My honor. Goodbye.
Thank you.